I will dive right in here and kind of hope for the best. So here we are, lecture 10. Not sure what that's all about. Kind of afraid to press any buttons there, but it looks like all systems are go. Beautify this slide, huh? Yeah, so today my plan is to talk a little bit about cost curves and competition. And while that might not be so exciting, it is also a way for us to kind of glimpse a little bit into the machinery of economics, right? How we sort of construct things from first principles in a way that is at once specific and general. But before I dive into that, maybe just a couple of administrative details. I've been sorting through if you've put in a grade correction on your exam, and I haven't gotten to it yet. I'm getting to them. I think I've done almost all of them, but I saw a couple more came in today. There are a couple of grade scope things I've been kind of straightening out as we've kind of gone along. So it turns out that Gradescope uses AI to match exams to people. And sometimes that didn't, work out perfectly, but I've been able to straighten that out pretty easily. So if you have a problem, just let me know. To turn this off here. Beyond that, I think we're kind of moving along here. So let's see, we've had about 12, 13 class periods. We're getting close to the halfway mark, right? Which is kind of it comes up fast. Pursuant to that, maybe what I'll do is I'll get rolling with the material today, and then at some point in time in a lull, I'll just remind you about some of the assignments that are up there. I think I gave you until tomorrow to do that sort of bonusy assignment, which once again is on, I'll show you, why not? I think I opened it up here. That is this assignment here. Hoping it'll come up here. I might have to revert to my original plan to do this. All right, well, maybe we'll do that a little bit later. Should be on Top Hat, and once again, it was on this idea, if I keep saying all these policies are welfare reducing, right, ceilings and floors and things of that nature, why do we have so many of them, right? It seems like this constant debate that, whether we're talking about tariffs, whether we're talking about things like rent control, minimum wages, surprisingly, I guess, most economists would agree that these things are disruptive, and there are better ways around the problems that they're trying to address. I should have added that. We'll get to that later. Why are there so many policies like this out there? So it looks like maybe, nope, not yet. Well, hopefully that'll load at some point. Okay, so I don't know if I think I put up chapter 10. If I didn't, I will add it up there. It'll be up and running soon. And so once again, I'm hoping to maybe by the end of the week have this whole first exam cycle resolved, right? And by that I mean all of your grades to date in class should be up into Brightspace, right? Which I don't usually use for class stuff, but has a really good grade book. I'm hoping to get everything there so you can go there and just kind of get a feel for where you stand. Okay, and I did add a new problem set. The reason why I put the due date there is because that is my roughest guess as to when we'll have our next exam. I know we have spring break intervening and all that stuff, so that's just to remind you that at some point we will be having another exam. So this is a busy slide, and maybe it serves to introduce what I'm going to talk about today, which I think I said were cost curves. Not very exciting. Well, this should be a little bit more exciting. Market structure is really what we're getting at here. So what we're trying to do here is, instead of just talking about market supply and demand, which we got a lot of mileage out of, by the way, we're going to think about maybe some of the details underlying the market, right? Ultimately, what we'll want to do is say, well, what is a market structure, and what sorts of market structures are conducive, I'll say, to some sort of better social functioning, I'll say, right? or which market structures tend to work in the interests of societal welfare as we understand it, right? By which I mean consumer and producer surplus being as large as they possibly can be. So we've ignored a lot of details along the way as we've talked about all these different sorts of goods and markets. We've had the market for cars, we've talked about phones, we've talked about bicycles, oil, corn, wheat. I think we've had some wine, I didn't mention that, wool, we have bottled water, and then I have phones again on my list, right? So I should take that off. Today we'll talk a little bit more about oil and a little bit about grilled cheese. I'm hoping if everything functions the way I kind of hope it will. Let me just, you know what, I'm going to get a head start on this. So I have this. All right, good. That's doing exactly what I hoped it would. You never know. So, I mean, you don't have to be an economist to notice that these markets are different in some very important ways, right? So if you think about the way wheat is produced and distributed throughout the United States, it's very different than the way phones are made, right? Most of you, for example, probably can name maybe all of the big phone producers, right? There's not too many of them. That's an important fact, right? They tend to be a couple of really big international high-tech firms. But most of you probably cannot name any wheat farmers, right? And probably don't know, much more beyond, wheat is grown in fields in the middle of the country perhaps, and then transported to markets and all that stuff. So those are some important differences, right? And when you think about that first example I gave you, where I said, well, there's a couple of big firms making this high-tech product, or there's many small farms producing wheat, which has been around for, millennia. That sort of matters, and we're going to have to figure out why and how it matters. And I guess you could even say, if we care from the perspective of society, right? And by what I mean by that, again, is what does this do for consumer and producer surplus? How does it matter? The other thing we'll get out of this is some understanding as to what you might call market dynamics, right? How does a market evolve and change over time, right? Are there differences when we're talking about these big high-tech firms, or we're talking about steel or phones or wheat, right? And along the way, what we're going to have to do is develop some rudimentary yet general understanding as to how firms make decisions, businesses and markets make decisions, right? And of course, decisions is there's an enormous set of things that goes into business decisions. We have to think about a way where we can sort of divide and conquer here, right? Like you want to think about something as complex as how a multinational firm operates. You first have to think about how the simplest firm operates and then build up from there. And that's kind of what we're doing. And along the way, we'll pick up some description of this thing I keep calling market structure. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to try to crush everything down in the beginning to just two decisions, right? Two kind of big and important decisions. And one is, you might even think about these as two principles that guide everything else. And maybe that's if you're, one day going to get into business or something like that. This is the way an economist thinks about these things should help you. So we'll think about, day-to-day production decisions. And we'll think about the meta decision, should I produce at all, right? That's kind of the way economists break the big decisions down to begin with, right? And we're going to think about how this industry works, right? Our task is seemingly kind of difficult. What we're trying to do is make sense of this very chaotic thing where you have, thousands, if not millions of individuals, business owners, making decisions. Really all they do is think about business conditions and then their day-to-day operations as I've described them here, right? So it's interesting because we want to make sense of all of this in some sort of organized way, right? Oftentimes, when I used to teach this subject, I would be like, oh, this is boring, students don't like it, but as I've sort of maybe gotten older and done this lecture as it's evolved, it's actually gotten more and more interesting, and I'm kind of in awe of this, right? That we're able to crush everything down in this way and make sense of it. So the way we're going to start is we're going to think about the simplest and most idealized setting. which we will call the competitive market, sometimes called the perfectly competitive market or perfect competition, right? So this is where businesses basically just look at their costs from production, and they look at the market price, right, as it exists at the moment, and that is all they need to know to make their decisions, right? And the nice thing about this is we're able to sort of work the whole problem all the way through, right? We can talk about what the firm does. We can talk about what the industry looks like. We can then talk about how the industry changes over time, and then we can even talk about all of our welfare things that we like to talk about, right? Consumer and producer surplus. We can talk about productive efficiency, going way back to the beginning of class. So with this simple idealized structure, which I think is interesting in and of itself, we can get all the way to the end of our problem, if you want to think about it that way. So how are we going to start? Once again, I'm always trying to make the case for starting as simple as possible. And so that's kind of what we're going to do. And we're going to make, I guess, the real life assumptions that make this simplified universe a little bit more realistic, right? So we'll say, okay, well, we have to make assumptions. What do these assumptions look like that at least give us this veneer, I'll say, of realism? So we're going to imagine that everybody's producing the same thing, right? Simple, identical products. And why do we do this? Well, this takes out all of these decisions. Like, we're not worrying about, once again, business decisions are complicated enough. This lets us think about just production. We don't have to think about marketing, product positioning, development of a product, all of these things, which, once again, very interesting. We'll get there. But we're starting with the simplest thing here. And we're going to assume that the firm is really small relative to the market. Why do we do this? Well, then we can view the firm as reacting to market conditions, not determining them, right? Once again, that's interesting, we'll get there, but it's also a lot harder, right? So, and we'll imagine that it's pretty simple to get in and out of this industry if you want to, right? That's important as well, and that maybe you can fold that into the previous one. It's hard to have lots of small firms if you can't sort of, if it's somehow hard to start up and get into this industry, right? So the way you usually say these things is we say there are small firms producing homogeneous products with free entry. You might see that in your typical book. And of course, the reason why we're making these assumptions is to just simplify the decision-making environment, right? And of course, students always want to run right to these things down here, right? The stuff that we teach, by the way, in our business certificate, which has always been very popular. What about advertising and product positioning and all these things? Hopefully we'll have a lot to say about those things as well. I was going to, so an example. It's always good to have a working example here. You can probably guess, or maybe your machinery has been working as I've been talking. You're saying, okay, well, what is Baker talking about here? Wheat is a pretty good example, right? In that, wheat production, it's probably easy for, maybe not us, but the typical farmer can probably grow wheat if the farmer wants to. Most wheat, maybe I'm slandering farmers here, but I think wheat is fairly generic. So that seems to fit the bill, stuff like that, right? Good like that. Not phones, right? Those last four things and the first things I mentioned there under the identical products are probably more than half the battle at least when you're producing phones. Okay, so once again, I know I keep saying the same thing, but it's worth saying one more time. This will serve as our benchmark, right? A good place to start with all of those things I'm talking about. Oh, one other thing is I think you'll find it surprising how easily we can take what we learned from this and move it around, right? And think about not only wheat, but things like oil and steel, maple syrup. I think I have some examples there. And of course, I like this idea of, sort of maybe fixing into your minds this idea that start as simply as possible, and then once you have that in place, you can change one thing at a time and see what happens, right, with your apparatus. Okay, so the key to doing all of this, is understanding costs from a particular perspective. And usually as economists, we depart from accountants in several important ways when it comes to thinking about costs. One important way is we already think about opportunity costs primarily as the key thing for decision making. What we're also going to do is break costs into really, well, I have three categories here, but the most important ones are the marginal and the average costs, right, for decision making. Almost everything we need to know about decisions, put another way, will be encoded in marginal and average costs. I'll show you how here in a second. Marginal costs, what are those? Well, you've probably gotten used to this idea of thinking about margins, right, as changes. If I do a little bit more of something, how do my costs change, right? If I'm already producing 10 cups of coffee a day, and I want to make another one, right, how does that change my overall costs, right, marginal costs? Average costs are just sort of you take all the money you're spending, right, and divide it by the number of units. We'll see that that's often a good guide to thinking about how well I'm doing, right, not what I should do. So the other important distinction we'll make, and I think accountants will make this distinction as well, is we'll think about fixed and variable costs, but in such a way so that they inform marginal and average costs. So fixed and variable costs, what are those? Well, fixed costs are costs that don't change with the amount that I produce, right? And variable costs are the amount that do change with the amount I produce, right? So I have my nice oil rig example that I'm going to discuss in a second here, just to show you the basic geometry of this. And you might say, well, the very first thing you have to do if you're going to get some oil out of your, you've struck oil somewhere and now you have to, in Texas maybe, and now you have to set up a derrick to get it going. The first thing you do is you have to, before you can pump any oil out of the ground, is you have to set up the derrick, right? And maybe a little building there, a break room, I don't know. So you have to build your establishment. That costs money, and you have to do that before you can produce anything, right? So that might be a fixed cost as we understand it. You just have to spend that money. Now, once you've done that and you start to pump oil, you now have to spend money actually getting the oil out of the ground, right? You need, first of all, workers, right? The more oil you want to get out of the ground, the more workers you need to hire. You maybe need to get electricity, right? You need transport. All of these things will go up and down the more you want to produce, right? So that's what we mean by fixed and variable costs. Now, we're going to imagine, one reason why I picked this example is because it's very easy to picture how this works, that the principle of increasing costs applies, right? You can think about it this way. Variable costs are driven by the principle of increasing costs. So what I mean by that is, boom, we spend the $2 million to set up the oil derrick. To get our first 10,000 barrels out of the ground, well, that's going to cost us $2 million. I just made up these numbers, so I don't know if they make any sense. That's going to cost us $2 million, right? The second barrel, given our derrick, is going to cost $3 million, right? So producing the second one, given we've already produced the first, is going to be relatively more expensive. Costs are increasing. Marginal costs are increasing. That is our principle of increasing costs we've been invoking throughout the semester. So our third barrel is going to be really hard to produce. It's going to cost an additional $4 million. Our third 10,000 barrels, I guess you could say. Now, why do I do this, or why do I use this oil rig example? Well, I think it's a stylized fact that if you want to produce more oil, you need progressively more power and energy to do so, right? Because the oil, for one, is just deeper in the ground. It's harder to pump it out, right? Okay, so the way I set this up is what I'm telling you once again is that marginal costs are increasing, and ultimately we will see that this is the reason why our supply curve slopes upward. Once again, we've already sort of used that idea, right? And maybe this slide is just, I've kind of said it already, but it does sort of hammer home the idea that the law of increasing opportunity, or the law of increasing costs, I'll say, is in effect here. Okay, so now we can actually, my crude data, we can, no pun intended there, Yeah, no, this is bad oil joke. Bad joke in general. We can kind of table everything up like this and describe how our costs will look as we scaled production up or down. So I have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 units, I guess, I could be producing. And over here, you can kind of see, and I'll break this down in some different ways for you so you can kind of see what happens here. My total cost when I produce output of 0, well, I'd incur 0 variable costs, right? If I want to produce no output, I don't need to spend any money on electricity or whatever, and I don't need to spend any money on labor, but I still have built my oil derrick, right? So that's why in red over there I have my 2 units of fixed costs. When I produce 1 unit of output, as my story goes, well, now my costs tick up to 2, my variable costs, right? Then I can just add that to my fixed costs, as I do on the far right over there. 2 plus 2 equals 4. That becomes my total costs. Okay? When I tick output up again from 1 to 2, well, you'll notice that variable costs have now gone from 2 to 5. Remember, I said this before, that the second unit costs me $3 million additional dollars to produce, right? So my costs will go up by $3 million additional dollars from 2 to 5. You can see it over here, right? So here we have 2 plus 3 plus 2 now gives me 7, and I think you see how it goes. 5 to 9, well, that's the $4 million I have to spend to produce my third barrel, and then 9 to 14, well, my fourth barrel cost me $5 million additional dollars, and there you get that should be 16, right? Maybe I can fix that on the fly while it's on my mind here. Oop. Yeah, there we go. So that's one way to sort of arrange all of this into a table. This is maybe the more informative way to do it, right? So all I've done is taken that last, you can kind of see my table at slide number 10 there. All I've done is taken the 2 columns there, the first column and the last column from slide 10, that's these here. The total costs, right, and the output. Now here what I've done is broken this out as marginal costs and average costs, right? Average costs is pretty simple. It's just costs per unit, right? So you take this, you divide it by this, you get this. And maybe you can see why the first number there is infinity. Well, that's because 2 divided by 0 is infinity, right? Marginal costs. Well, I used it to sort of get the total cost, but you could also sort of think about computing this from this. You can see that this is the change, right? As we go from 0 to 1, costs go from 2 to 4, right? That's where that 2 comes from. As we go from 1 to 2, costs go from 4 to 7. That's where that 3 comes from. Okay? So here we have average and marginal costs, and I'm hopefully going to show you how these things are really the key to understanding my day-to-day decision-making as a runner of an oil rig, right? How much oil I should produce, what I'm going to make in so doing. Now the graph here is extremely important. Well, it's important. I don't know if it's extremely important. But it shows a lot of the ideas here that I've been talking about. The blue curve plots out those average costs, right? Yes? And the orange curve is marginal costs, right? So marginal costs are going up. Once again, that's my principle of increasing costs. Average costs, it might not be obvious to you, but they have this kind of U-shape, right? It's taking on this U-shape. That's sort of important, and you can sort of think about this as unit costs, cost per unit. They're driven by, I guess, the collision of two things. First of all, ultimately, average costs are going to go up, right? Because marginal costs go up, right? Each unit is progressively more expensive to produce, right? Every time we produce another unit, we incur a greater additional cost. So that's going to pull costs up. Well, why do average costs fall in the beginning? Well, you might attribute that to the so-called, you call it sometimes the spreading, I guess you could say, of fixed effects, or not fixed effects, fixed costs. Right? So every time you produce more, the fixed costs are spread over smaller units, or a greater number of units, and become smaller, right? So if you're spending a fixed amount of money and producing more units, the fixed costs per unit go down, right? So if you're going, you might notice this if you're going on vacation for spring break, right? You're going to, I don't know, Daytona or wherever people go these days. The fixed cost effect might be manifest in the idea that if you can get a whole bunch of your friends to go and stay in a hotel room, well, then the costs of the hotel room become very low, right? So $200 a night. Well, with two people, the average costs, I'll say, right, the costs per person are pretty high. But if you get, say, 8 people in there, $25 a night now, right? So the average costs go down. That's kind of the idea here. The spreading of fixed costs coupled with increasing marginal costs give us this nice U shape. Now, there's something else very interesting about this, the relationship between these cost curves. And, I kind of said all this stuff, fixed, average, marginal, all that stuff. The big thing to note here is that there's this other additional geometric aspect, that average cost is cut at its minimum by marginal cost, right? That is to say, marginal cost goes through average cost at this minimum point there. You see I've kind of drawn it right there at 2. That looks like the minimum of average cost, and our marginal cost goes right through that minimum point. That's no accident, right? It's a geometric property of average costs and marginal costs. In fact, this is true if you would take Eco 200 or 300 or whatever one day when you're majoring in economics, hopefully. You'll realize this is a general property of averages and marginals in general, right? And so you can think about some simple examples here. I'll give you an average. Let's suppose I were to take the average height of everybody in this class, right? So we record all the heights, compute the average, divide by the number of people. We get some number, I don't know what it would be, 5, let's say 5'7". Is that too tall, you think? I don't know, who cares? 5'7", right? So that would be our average value. Now what would happen, yes?
Would you get rid of outliers in this case?
No, right? That's an interesting question. We don't need to worry about the statistical properties, I guess, of this average, which is maybe a good thing to note because this emphasizes that it is this general idea. So we take the average height, right? We have it. I don't know, 5'7", we'll say. What would happen to this average if Karl Anthony Towns walked into the room and we recomputed it? First of all, if you don't know who Karl Anthony Towns is, he plays for the Knicks, right? He's about 7 feet tall, right? So if we added him into the average, what would happen to the average? It would go up, right? So think about it this way. If you add something marginal to an average greater than the average goes up, right? Now let me think of Danny DeVito, right? Does everybody know who Danny DeVito is? Okay. So he's an actor. He's pretty short, right? I think he's maybe just over 5 feet tall. If he walked into the room and we computed the average, right? Well, then the average would go down, right? So if we add something to the average smaller than the average goes down. We add something to the average greater than the average goes up. You can kind of see that that's what's going on here, right? Marginal costs below average costs are going down. Well, when marginal costs are greater than average costs are going up, right? And maybe the final consequence of this is that marginal has to cut average at its minimum point, right? So you put that little story, you put all those things together, this is kind of what you get. Right, you can get different, like one day maybe you'll talk about average product and marginal product, and then, the principle applies a little bit differently, but the principle is there always when you're talking about average and marginal. Kind of neat, right? Okay, so I said all that stuff. So why do we care? Maybe this is interesting. Well, what I'm hopefully going to show you is that marginal costs are the key to guiding business decisions. I guess you could say day-to-day operations if you wanted to make it sound more interesting, I guess. Average costs kind of show us the consequences from these decisions, right? So if I'm a business, if I'm making decisions, what I do is I look at my marginal costs, I compare them to the market, right, and make a decision. And then I can sort of look at my average costs and say, okay, well now what do I get out of my best possible decision? I'll show you in a second. So one thing we'll learn from this is that marginal costs and supply, maybe we'll even call it short-run supply, whatever that means, they're the same thing, right? We've already said that supply reflects costs. Well, we can hone that statement a little bit and say that supply reflects marginal cost. One thing we'll learn, I got to be careful with this, is that average costs in this competitive environment we're talking about often tell us what the long-run supply in an industry will look like. And now I'm throwing around words I haven't even defined yet, short run, long run, all that stuff. But that will, hopefully, when we talk about time and dynamics and all of that stuff, you'll see how all that works. But we're getting a little ahead of ourselves, but the logic is pretty simple, and we've implicitly at least been using it all along. So you can imagine something like think about this, a situation where this happens here. So let's suppose I was producing 1,000 units of, well, I'm going to switch examples in a second to grilled cheese. So let's suppose I was producing 1,000 units of grilled cheeses a day at a price of $10, right? And somehow the price for my sandwiches in the market goes up to 12. And then I might ask myself, oh, the price is higher, what should I do, right? Well, a business owner would say, well, maybe I can expand production here. How much more? Well, the answer will be just keep producing until my marginal costs go up to meet this $12 or so, right? I'll show you how that works. If the price falls, do the opposite. Lower my production until I'm about at where marginal costs are, right? And then we can sort of say, well, okay, this is what I'm doing on a day-to-day basis. I'm following the price. I'm following the price on my marginal costs up and down. How am I doing overall? Well, when the price is $12, I would hope that my average costs are less than $12. Then I'm making a profit, right? And in fact, the price minus average costs we'll call the profit margin. Okay, so now let's look at my grilled cheese operation here. And I've kind of drawn all this out, and that's pretty small. Let me see if I can zoom in. I don't know if I can. Should I try this in, maybe I can do, let me try to do this. Oh. I know this is, that's a little better, right? Hopefully you can kind of see that a little bit better. It's also a lot of information here, but it's essentially the same information that I was giving you with my oil example. You know what, let me also do this here. This is hard to look at. That's better, much better, right? It's kind of exactly what I've been talking about before, but maybe I can kind of read into this a little bit here. So if you think about what's happening here, I have 0 to 16 units, so I have a lot of options here to produce. And once again, if you want it to be more realistic, you can sort of think about these units as more realistic. So you can think about this as sandwiches I produce per week or something, right? Where I'm producing a grilled cheese sandwich that just kind of fits all those assumptions that I was talking about before, right? It's no different than any other grilled cheese. So I don't have to worry about that. It's just your average everyday grilled cheese sandwich. And I can vary my units from 0 to 16 on any given day, maybe 1,600 any week, whatever the unit of time is. Now the marginal costs you see here, every time I produce a unit, Well, the marginal costs are, from the first unit, 50 cents per grilled cheese. For the second unit, they're $1, right? So that means that if I produce 2 units, my total average costs are, my variable costs are going to be 1.5 from producing 2 units, right? Remember, the marginal cost is the change, is what I'm trying to say here. Okay, moving off of that for a second, you can also see up there at 0, my total costs are $8, right? So that means I have to spend $8, I don't know, on a grill or whatever, just to get up and running before I can produce anything, right? And you can read that off the top, 0, 0, 8, right? But you can see here, I've now added in a price, right? And so when I put these things all together, we'll be able to figure out what I should do when my goal is to maximize this thing, this profit thing here, right? We'll get to that in a second. Maybe I'll even change the price here. So let me just see here. Let's try this. Where do I? Oh, I know what I should do. Oh, right here. So I have my price there. I can make it, I'll put it at 6 here. Now, one thing you can do is you can kind of graph all this stuff out. Let me see if I can grab, there we go. And you can see here that my curves have the usual shape here, or the shape I've given them. The blue curve on this graph, just goes exactly with this data. That's my marginal cost, right? It's kind of increasing, principle of increasing costs. Yes? The red curve is my average cost. We see that it has the U shape, right? It's initially coming down as I spread my $8 of fixed costs all around, and then it starts going up as the principle of increasing costs, marginal costs increasing, kicks in, right? And then I just have this price line in there. I've just added it in there, that's 6, and you'll see why in a second. So those are my cost curves. Over here, once I have price, I can now compute some other things. I can compute my revenue, right, from each of my units, because here's my price is 6. If I produce 16 units, 16 times 6 gives me $96 in revenue, right? It's just price times quantity, this column here. So for another example, when I produce 10 units, column 14 here, 10 times 6 gives me 60 in revenue. Now, as a business owner, what you care about, of course, is profit. You would like it to be as large as possible. Well, what is profit? No surprises here for any of you accounting majors. Profit is revenues minus costs, right? What are costs here? Well, I have those computed right here. Total costs, right? They add up my $8, the costs I incur, my variable costs every time I produce a little bit. So for every amount produced, here are my costs. It looks like let's look at column 14. When I produce 10 units, my marginal costs from the 10th unit are 5. My total costs are 8 plus all the costs I incur producing those units up to 5. The price is 60, so if I go 60 minus 35.5, 24.5 is my profits, right? Now, you're probably, I can tell you're already thinking about this. You can look at those two things, and the way I've kind of figured out these numbers, the total cost and total revenue curves kind of look like this. So revenue is just a flat line because it's just price times quantity, right? So as I increase quantity, it just goes up with the slope equal to the price. The cost curve is a little bit more complex, right, the way I've drawn it up here. What we're trying to do is get those things as far apart from each other as possible, right? That's profits. We're not going to kill ourselves thinking about that stuff. We don't really have to, because we have this beautiful little chart here which kind of tells us what to do, right? So you can see here the largest possible profits, given the way I've set up the problem, when the price is 6. Maybe I'll change it a little bit here. How about we make it nice and so we don't get a tie here. What if I do 7? We still have a tie. How about 6.5? 650 is the going price here. Okay, suppose that 675 is the price of a grilled cheese here. I was just trying to do that to make that pretty clear here, right? Make it as clear as possible. Let me ask you, what's the profit maximizing price here? I mean, what the quantity? What should I produce when I am a grilled cheese maker with this? You might even, I can say it this way. This is my technology of production as reflected in my costs. Where do I make the most profits? 13, let's see. Okay, at 13, yes, my profits are $34.25. That is the maximum, right, profits I can make here. Okay? It's a little bit complicated. It's kind of hard to see on this graph, right? But fortunately, there's a very simple rule we can use for figuring out the profit maximizing output here. And all we have to do is look at a simple diagram like this and look at one number here. So you'll notice when the price is $6.75, right? You'll notice that marginal cost, as we get to this amount 13, well, marginal cost gets very close to the price, right? As close as it possibly can get without going over, right? And that is, in fact, a generic rule, right? And I think I mentioned it before on the previous slide, right? Keep producing so long as marginal cost is less than price, right? So all we have to do is sort of look at this curve, or look at the blue line here, and we can just sort of see, right, where we should produce. So you'll notice that the blue line and the yellow line, they hit right around this 13 it was here. It's pretty dang close to 13. If the curves were smoother, it would be exact, right? And this is the birth of our general rule. Produce up until the point where price equals marginal cost, right? So we can even play around with this a little bit, right? Let's see here. If I change the price to 5, well, let's see here. I'm just going to look here. When the price is 5, here's marginal cost. Once again, my example's a little blocky, but you can see here at 10 units, our profits are maximal. I mean, I know there's another one, but we're kind of splitting the difference here. So if I changed it to, let's say, 501 or something, right, now we get an exact answer here. I can break my tie. 1460, right where marginal costs get as close as they possibly can be to price, right? If I change the price to, let's see, I don't want to go too crazy here, 7.51. Well, 7.51, you can see here my profits are, I didn't even look, I should be careful. My profits are largest here, right? All I have to do is look for the point where marginal costs get as close as they can get without going over. So over here, right, I have kind of a little guide to this that I put together, right? So if I were to announce a price of 3, right, well, you don't really have to do any of this funny stuff here. And we'll get used to thinking about this graphically. It's kind of nice to think about it graphically. All you would have to do is say, if I say, hey, if the price is 3, what should Baker do with this grilled cheese operation? You would just look at marginal cost in the units, right? You'd say, okay, produce where marginal costs are about equal to the price, so 6. If I were to say, what about a price of 3.5? You'd say 7, right? What about a price of 4? You would say 8, right? What about a price of 4.5? You would say 9. And of course, I can just I have this handy little thing here. I'll test it out here. Oop, don't want to do that. I'll put in my price of, what did I do? I don't even know. Put in a price of 4 here. And you can see once again that right here, my profits, once again, there's a tie, but that's okay. Marginal costs are 4, equal to price, and my profits are as high as they can be at 6, right? So, by the way, if I were to just do I have a graph of that there? Let me see, maybe I have it lurking here at the bottom. Well, there's a profit curve, that's not so useful. This little thing here, maybe I can just do this on the fly. You think I can do it? Yeah, okay, so I can graph this relationship between price and quantity, right? 6, 7, 8, 9 are the quantities, 3, 3.5, so on and so forth. What is that? Supply, right? That's my firm's supply curve. And maybe now you can see that really supply and marginal cost are exactly the same thing. There are some details behind that matter, but for our purposes, yes. Okay, so one other thing we care about, well, you'll notice here, I can actually, if I look at my diagram, all of this makes perfect sense diagrammatically as well. And there's even more information here. Well, maybe we'll get to this next time. I know these technical material days are tough to digest all at once. The price here is 4, right? That's my hypothetical price. That puts me right here at, 8 units or so. It looks about right. I'm looking there and over there. The other thing you can see here is we also get a notion as to what my profit margin is, right, at this price. So what do I mean by that? Well, the profit margin, when I'm maximizing my profits, well, that's the difference between the price and the cost per unit. Price and average cost, right? Average cost is cost per unit. The price is $4. So if I look at 4 here and I read off the red curve there, that will give me my cost per unit. That is, by the way, let's see, what am I doing here? The price is 4. I'm producing 8 units. Average cost is 3.25 and the price is 4. So my profit margin is 75 cents, right, per unit. That's the difference between these two curves, right? So that tells me, well, it tells me, one, that I'm making a profit because price is above average cost. And you can see what happens here to this distance. Here, I'll show you this little distance right here. Oh, that's nice. Look at that. 4. I could have been doing that all along. 4 and 3.25. Well, if I change the price to something like, let's say, is 7 a little crazy here? But we'll see. 7. Now you can see that the graph looks very different, but we can do the exact same recipe. We find the amount that I produce, marginal cost going to price there, and then you can see the profit margin is pretty large. It's the distance between the red line and this crossing point. So let's see, that is 7 down here. Average costs are 4.32. So that profit margin is something like 3.68, 2.68, right? Yeah. $2.68 per grilled cheese. So what you can do, by the way, is now you can just sort of look at a graph like this and figure out everything you need to know about the firm. How is it doing, right? And what it should be doing, right? Find where the yellow and blue intersect, marginal cost and price intersect. That maximizes profits. Look at the difference between yellow and red, price and average cost. That's the profit margin. The bigger the better, right? But sometimes, these things aren't so great, and it's worthwhile thinking about this. When the price gets low, the profit margin gets slim. That's what it looks like on the graph. This is a price of 3.5, right? Slim profit margin there, right? What if it goes down some more? What if it goes to 3? Ooh, that's rough, right? So you can see here, what is my maximal profit? Where am I maximizing profits? Well, when the price is 3, price and marginal cost are equal at 6 units, right? So I maximize profits by making 6 units, but you can see here there's sort of bad news for my business. Profits are negative everywhere, right? So in effect, when I maximize profits, I'm minimizing losses, right? So unfortunately, that's an important part of business too. We will see that this is kind of a guide to maybe I should be getting out of this business. So one thing we can actually do is I'm going to try to do this here, is we can think about this price. Boy, I'm trying to get it here. I don't know what it is, but I'm trying to find it. I can't seem to get it right. I will, though, in a second. You know what I'm trying to do, by the way? I'll stop here. I'm trying to find a price at which profits are exactly 0, right? And it's a little bit tricky sometimes to fiddle with things to get it to be this way. But hopefully you can get a feel for where this point is on the graph here. Here I almost got my profit maximizing point at a price of 307 is, wait, let me ask you, which point? It looks like the best I can possibly do is lose 8 cents, right? So that's at 6 units of output. But you can kind of see what's happening, right? That profit goes to 0 right around this 6 point here, which also happens to be the point at which average costs and marginal costs cross, right? That's something like our break-even point. In fact, that's what you call it. Question? Yeah?
Yeah, so there is software for this that...
So you know what? That's a good question. I think nowadays, yeah, there's a lot of businesses use software, particularly in, if you want to think about oil and, usually I will say, though, most of the software thinks about the cost side of things and at the same time the price side. Here, we have the simplified world where I'm just given the price. I can't do anything to influence it. But hotels, for example, they have these very complicated routines for figuring out, if we run X amount of hotel rooms, it costs this amount, total costs are this, cost per unit are that. We can price it this. Some of them will be empty. Very complex algorithms. I had a student who got involved in the hotel pricing game. But there's algorithms and things like that that do this. Probably better than my spreadsheet, but this is something that you often do if you become an economist at a business and have to, help them think about pricing and profits and all that. Okay, so, right, you can, and maybe I'll even show you what it looks like on the graph one more time. If the price were 2.5, we're now in this unfortunate position, right, where we stick to our guns and maximize profits here, but you can see P is everywhere below the average cost curve. So whatever we do, we're going to lose money. That's just how we'll lose the least amount of money. And there are, we don't need to figure out every last detail of this diagram. Hopefully you can kind of see how interesting and useful it is for just organizing how we think about these things. Okay. So if we think about this, if you want to think about what the rule is for maximizing profits, if we want to boil it down into just a simple formula, well, you would say that when the additional revenue is greater than the additional cost, you should make another unit, right? So if it increases your revenue more than your costs, produce that unit. The way we would say this in economics speak is when marginal revenue, or in this case it's price, right? Every time we produce a unit and sell it, we get price. We should produce the unit. Additional revenue greater than additional costs produce. So just the way you might think about all of this is as follows. When P is greater than MC, produce. another unit. If P is less than MC, do not produce the unit. You might say the first one is increase production, the second is decrease. When you get to P equals MC, that's it. You've hit the sweet spot, right? P equal MC, price equal marginal cost. So this diagram really that we're talking about is an example of Marshallian economics, that marginal cost, average cost with the price line thrown in there. That was really kind of, when microeconomics first got up and running in the 1900s, this diagram came into general usage. And it, you'd be surprised how nuanced it is. And in fact, we're going to get into some of the other details there. For example, you can see things like profit on the diagram itself, and you can also use it as a guide for thinking about how industries evolve over time. We're going to get into all of that. And that was something that Alfred Marshall did. So we did say this, that I don't know if it's the last thing, that supply curve that the firm has there just mirrors the marginal cost curve, right? That's a consequence of that price equal marginal cost rule, telling us how much to make, right? One little tidbit here, I can't help myself. I know one reason why I wasn't all that excited about making sure that we got up and running is I was thinking this is a little bit heavy lifting, a lot of math, maybe our mathiest lecture of the year. So we might end a tad early here, but let me just, I was hoping I could show you this. Maybe I can do it this way. Yeah, okay. So this average cost curve, it turns out, people have been kind of thinking about it for a while, and I stumbled upon this paper some time ago, and it's kind of interesting. And so one of the ways we're going to be thinking about this when we think about technological progress and business decisions is you can sort of think about one of the business decisions that you have to make as what kind of cost curves do I want to have, right? And we'll, or put another way, what should the scale of my operations want to be? Intuitively, what you can do is you can spend a lot of money up front, right, on a really efficient, say, oil derrick or a giant grilled cheese grill, right? But you really only want to do that if you know you're going to produce a massive amount of grilled cheeses or oil, right? You don't need a giant grill to produce, 10 sandwiches a day. So you have to think about this, and we'll see that this has implications for what those cost curves look like, right? And it's kind of a neat way to think about different sorts of decisions. So the earliest application of this logic that anybody has been able to find is actually in the old music publishing business. We have Gottfried Christoph Härtel. How did I did do with my pronunciation there, Richard? Yeah. Good? Yeah. It's not bad? Maybe that's not how you'd say it in Stuttgart, though, right? Anyways, so Christoph Gottlob Breitkopf, right? He acquired this publishing business, and he figured out that there were different ways to typeset music, right? So back in those days, you could use kind of the whole thing, like kind of the Gutenberg, set the type with metal, pewter or whatever, or you could just use a copper engraving of the music and just stamp that, right? Now, one of these things was a lot more costly than the other, and so what this fellow had the idea of doing was kind of something like this, right? He said, well, if I engrave, right, things, well, the costs of producing each unit kind of look like that. If I typeset things, which is a little bit more, I think, time-consuming, well, the quantity of each unit that I produce, the cost of each unit I produce goes down, so the question becomes, when do I do which of these different sorts of things? So it's kind of an interesting, that's not a great description of what's going on here. But he did, as you can see in this article, computed a whole detailed tabular comparison of average total costs, right? And that was what he kind of graphed out. Okay, so, and then he sort of backs out, various aspects of cost. So it's kind of interesting that he was thinking about things this way. And we'll be able to do something very similar to that, right, when we talk about the scale of operations and how industry works over time. Yeah, one last thing, the publishing industry was really interesting back in those days. There was no, later on in class, we'll talk about things like intellectual property. In those days, the publisher kind of owned the music, right? So you didn't have the rights to your book or whatever, it was kind of the publisher would buy the rights to the book and then publish it, right? So they would own kind of the creative property. Anyways, let's leave it at that for today. I know that's a lot of heavy lifting. I appreciate everybody bearing with me. Keep the exam stuff coming, and I'll try to get all that straightened out for you in the near future.